Welcome to Research Debrief. I'm Rachel Chonko, Editor-in-Chief of Club Solutions, here with Luke Carlson, CEO of Discover Strength, for a podcast aimed at bridging the gap between the fitness industry and the latest science in under 20 minutes. Luke, welcome.
Great to see you, Rachel. Good to be here.
All right, what are we going to talk about today?
Yeah, this is a hot topic. So this paper was published just a couple months ago. We're always trying to take a paper that was published very recently. So this paper is published in the Journal of Sports Medicine. I think this is one of the hottest topics in all of fitness. It's about Zone 2 training. So the title of the paper is Much Ado About Zone 2, a narrative review assessing the efficacy of Zone 2 training for improving mitochondrial capacity and cardiorespiratory fitness in the general population. So big picture, we're talking about cardio. Over the last 2 years, the idea that we should focus on Zone 2 training has been popularized by seemingly all the pundits, all the podcasters, kind of popular authors, the Peter Attias of the world. And so this paper is a response to that. Now, this is a narrative review. We had talked on previous episodes that we want to focus on not just individual studies, we want to do some meta-analytical studies. So a meta-analysis is a collection of all the studies in a particular topic, pouring some statistics over top of those studies and understanding what's the current state of the science. And a meta-analysis is really valuable. This is not a meta-analysis. This is a narrative review. So this is not even an individual research study. It's just a scientific paper published in a scientific journal. Sports Medicine is what's called a high impact factor scientific journal. So this is a well-respected journal. And these researchers, I think, are the best in their respective fields. And so it's a group of researchers that say, let's look at all the research. Let's do a narrative review. Let's look at all the studies that say, does Zone 2 training work better than higher level of intensity cardio? So let's just get definitions out there. Zone 1 training would be walking at the slowest imaginable pace, right? Zone 2 training is just a little bit more intense, but it's the idea that we should be conversational in our exercise. We shouldn't work very hard. I'm going to come back to that. Zone 3 is a little bit more intense. Zone 4 is I'm really busting my butt. Zone 5 is I'm sprinting basically as hard as I can, right? So that's the zones of intensity of effort in our cardiorespiratory or cardiovascular exercise. Over the last 2 years, we've learned from so many pundits that Zone 2 training might be more beneficial than working at Zone 3 or Zone 4. People like Peter Attia are saying things like, and there's a million podcast episodes that are talking about this, and articles being written and books being published saying, if you work out too hard, you're actually not going to get the mitochondrial capacity benefits, the cardiorespiratory fitness benefits. We should be working out less hard. And we're seeing this, we're hearing this. I'm hearing it from consumers that I'm making sure I don't work too hard because I want to get the benefits. And these researchers said, is this actually true? And so that's what this paper is focused on. So if you're ready, Rachel, that's just setting the stage. I'll dive into kind of the outcomes of this important paper.
Yes, please.
And the reason I think this paper is so important is, okay, clearly we've talked about strength training in this podcast before. This is cardio. We're going to talk about all different forms of exercise. This is the most talked about aspect of cardiovascular, cardiorespiratory training currently. This is what everyone is focused on. So in their introduction, they say popular media has recently positioned Zone 2 training, defined as low intensity exercise below the lactate threshold, as the optimal intensity for improving mitochondrial and fatty acid oxidation capacity, thereby supporting cardiometabolic health and chronic disease prevention. So the idea is we should do Zone 2 training because it's going to improve our cardiorespiratory fitness and it's going to help us mitigate disease. Those are my words. I'm going to continue reading. These recommendations largely stem from observational data of elite endurance athletes who engage in large volumes of Zone 2 training and possess high mitochondrial and fatty acid oxidative capacity. So I'm going to pause there for a second. Where does all this come from? It's so important that we understand this. This idea, this focus on Zone 2 comes from, and they speak to it in the paper, comes from the observation, and this observation is coming from Peter Attia. He loves cycling. And let me just back up. Peter Attia is the physician who is widely popular, a podcast that has millions of listeners, and he's making millions of dollars talking about longevity. And he wrote a book called Outlive. It's a really good book. He is a celebrity in this space and he's into cycling. And these authors, these researchers, say he's into cycling and he's observed that cyclists that are successful do a lot of zone two training. So this is true of
Hmm.
Tour de France winners. Okay, they have to do a lot of low intensity cycling to improve as a cyclist. Now, I'm a marathon runner. This is true in the marathon running world as well. The people that are winning the big city marathons, the world marathon majors, they're running 110, 120, 140 miles in a week, and they're doing most of it at zone two. So about
Okay.
80% of the work they do, they're not working very hard. They're just jogging. And so Peter Attia said, oh, we should do that as well. These people have this great high mitochondrial and fatty acid oxidative capacity. They have really good cardiorespiratory fitness. We should do what they're doing. Okay, that's where this notion comes from. I'm going to continue to read here. This is where we left off. These recommendations largely stem from observational data of elite endurance athletes, that's what we just mentioned, who engage in large volumes of zone 2 training and possess these high mitochondrial and fatty acid oxidative capacities. However, we challenge the broad endorsement of zone 2 training for members of the general public. So people that just want to resist or ward off chronic disease, cardiovascular disease, as it contradicts substantial evidence supporting the use of high intensity exercise for improving mitochondrial capacity and cardiometabolic health. So that's their introduction. They say, we conclude, we're just going to jump right to the end, and then we'll get into more nuance. We conclude that the current evidence does not support zone 2 training as the optimal intensity for improving mitochondrial or fatty acid oxidative capacity. So that is the big take home message
In the general population?
in the general population. So they would go on to say, if you're trying to win the New York City Marathon, you should do a lot of zone 2 training. But the reason you need to do a lot of zone 2 training to win the New York City Marathon is there's specific adaptations. One of them is what's called running economy. It's our ability to run at a given pace while keeping our oxygen utilization consistent. One of those adaptations is running economy. Running economy can improve with zone 2 training. And so doing more zone 2 training will actually improve that. The reality is for an endurance athlete, so someone actually competing in the Tour de France, running a marathon, etc., most of their performance improvement comes from really high intensity work. So busting their butt in some intervals, right? Running 5 to 6 miles really fast. For a marathon runner, maybe doing a 12-mile run where there's some high quality work in that 12 miles where they're really pushing the pace. But you can't run that for 120 miles. So they do that for maybe 30 to 40 miles a week. And then they want to do more running because there's more adaptation that occurs. So what do they do for the other 80 miles? They just run slowly. Now,
Yeah.
for all of us, if we did 30 to 40 miles of really running hard, that's a heck of a lot of aerobic exercise. If you ran 40 miles a week at a really high level of intensity, that's a tremendous amount of aerobic exercise. These
Yeah.
individuals who are doing an extraordinary amount of aerobic exercise, and let me just cut to the chase, you can't do 120 miles a week of super high level of intensity aerobic exercise because you're going to get injured, right? So they do
Yeah.
about 20% of it hard, and they do about 80% of it not hard. These researchers, we're going to cut to the very end here, are saying if you just want to get in great shape, if you want to improve your cardiovascular fitness, if you want to mitigate cardiovascular disease risk, if you want to live longer, you don't need to do any of the zone 2 stuff. You could just do the harder stuff, and that's it. And by the way, we don't need to do 40 miles of it. We're talking about running here. You don't need to do that much of it. But the stuff that we do, the exercise that we do engage in, if you do it at a higher level of intensity, you're going to produce much faster results, much better results. Okay, so I just want to make sure we understand that when we copy what athletes do and we assume that's what's going to make us more fit, that is just not the case. And one of my observations over the last 20 years is generally in fitness, we learn about fitness from other fit people. So it would make sense. How do you get in better cardiovascular shape? Let's ask marathoners. Let's ask Tour de France people. We should not be taking that approach because there's a difference between getting better at the sport of marathon running and the sport of cycling, which is what we're talking about here, versus getting in great cardiovascular shape. The analogy I like
Yeah.
to use is If you don't play basketball, you should spend no time shooting free throws, right? Because getting better at shooting free throws is really specific to playing basketball. And
Yeah.
so if you're not going to run marathons competitively at a high level, you don't need to do a tremendous amount of zone two training. So one of their key points, they say zone two training is touted by influential commentators, including on podcasts and in popular and social media, as the optimal training intensity for improving mitochondrial and fat oxidative capacity, thereby supporting metabolic health and chronic disease prevention. Our review failed to uncover substantial evidence supporting claims that zone 2 is superior to higher exercise intensities for improving mitochondrial and fat oxidative capacity. So their recommendation is you don't need to do as much, but you got to work much harder. Now, one of the authors on this paper is, I think, the best known. He's the leading researcher worldwide on interval training. His name is Dr. Martin Gabala. He's at McMaster University in Canada. One of the other key authors here is a guy named Brendan Gerd. Let's just go back to Martin Gabala. Much of his research would say you can work really hard for 30 seconds or a minute, rest for about 2 minutes. You can do that 4, 5, 6 times, and that will improve your VO2 max.
Wow.
Okay. Collectively, their research is showing you could work really hard for 10 to 12 minutes on a bike, on an elliptical, on a treadmill, whatever stationary cardio you're into, you could do it swimming, and you would get more cardiovascular disease protection benefit than if you did 60 minutes of zone 2 training. So they dispel the myth that has been largely popularized by so many of these pundits. Rachel, this is why we're doing this podcast. There's just so much misinformation out there, and much of the misinformation is spread by well-intended people. They lean into this. They say, I'm sure Peter Attia is well-intended, but his recommendation is not based on the preponderance of evidence. If you're going to engage in aerobic exercise, doing it at a higher level of intensity absolutely improves your cardiorespiratory fitness to a greater extent than doing lower level of intensity zone 2 training. Now, here is the big caveat, or just the big addition. If you're doing no exercise whatsoever, doing some exercise produces phenomenal results. This is what's so confusing is sometimes it sounds like we're saying you got to bust your butt or it's not worth doing. That is not the case. If you're doing nothing, and let's be clear, much of the world is doing nothing, doing something produces phenomenal benefit. Going from 1,000 steps a day to 7,000 steps a day at a low level of intensity, that would be zone 2 training, produces significant cardiorespiratory adaptation, reduces our risk of death from all causes. We definitely should move versus not moving. However, what these pundits have said is that you should stay at that level. The zone 2 is really the key. And what this research is saying is if you could increase your intensity beyond just doing something, you don't even have to do very much of it. But if you just worked harder, you'd receive much better cardiorespiratory benefit.
Yeah. I think that is an important distinction because we've talked previously about how time is often a huge barrier for people to exercise. And so if you have people thinking that they need to come in and do an hour of zone 2 training, that to me seems more overwhelming than someone coming in and working out in zone 3 or 4 for 15 minutes.
I couldn't agree more. And that's exactly how the researchers conclude this, right? We have time as a major barrier. We have to make exercise more palatable to the consumer. And that's not a lazy statement. If you worked out for 15 minutes a few times a week, you'd maximize these benefits. Their very last sentence in the entire paper is for members of the general public. Okay. Another way to read that is for members walking into all of our health clubs, attempting to meet physical activity guidelines, we believe prioritizing higher exercise intensities is critical to improve health. So that's our take-home message is we got to get people working a little bit harder. Now, this message has largely been shared with our medical community as well. Don't tell your patient as a primary care physician to just start walking more because walking more is probably not going to be nearly as beneficial as if they just busted their butts for 10 minutes or 15 minutes. Now, let's be clear, you can work out longer than that if you want to. So I think about the average club offering a group exercise class, offering a spin class. If that spin class is 45 minutes or 60 minutes, there's going to be intensity in the interval training in that spin class that's high enough that drives these benefits. They're going to get out of zone 2. They're going to spend time in zone 3 and definitely zone 4 and zone 5 and absolutely perform exercise that's aligned with what this paper is talking about. So we keep saying you could do 15 minutes, you can. It's not bad if you do 45 minutes or 60
Yeah.
minutes, where some of it is definitely more intense. Think about kind of classic interval training. So many of our clubs have offered this for a long time. This paper just offers so much evidence to say this is what we should be encouraging. As a club operator, we should communicate to our members that, hey, our classes that push you a little bit, this is really good. This is how you enhance your cardiorespiratory fitness. We don't need to be on a bike. We don't need to be on a treadmill for an hour or an hour and a half at a really low level of intensity.